Okay, so this is lesson number 9, and in this video we're going to cover collections. And collections are basically a list or a group of objects. It can be numbers, it can be strings, it can be other classes or objects that you put into a list or a collection that you'll ultimately iterate through or loop through in order to do stuff with. Let me give you a good example in Tekla speak. So let's say that you want to scan all of the selected objects in the model. Well, when you go get the selected objects in the model, you need to have a list or a collection of those objects for yourself to iterate through. So in this video, we're going to talk about the collections piece, and then in the next video, we're going to talk about how to loop through collections. All right, so what I need you to do is create a new Windows Forms application, create 3 buttons on there. There's going to be an add button, a remove button, and then you'll put a text box here. And so the add button should be called button_add, and then remove should be button_remove. And then basically the text box, which I forgot to name here, text_inputs. So that's basically the strings that we're going to add and remove to the collection. And then there's a show button and then a label_results. And the show button is going to just basically print out or show what the current list of objects is or the current collection is. All right, so go ahead and do that. I'm going to pause the video, make that and match everything here as shown on my form, and then we'll get into the code. Okay, to get started, we're actually going to double click on the background of the form itself. So not on these specific buttons, but if we just go to the top of the form designer here and double click, it's going to actually create a form load event handler. And so essentially, when the application starts and the form first loads, it will execute the code inside of this block here. Now, at the very top of this class, you'll see here there's actually the declaration of this class, so form1, and then this is actually called the constructor, which basically means when the form is created, it will execute this code here. I'm not going to explain too much of that in this video, but I just want you to understand that pretty much everything that has to do with this form that we're working with, this Windows Form application, everything that we're coding kind of lives in this code block of this open curly bracket and this closed curly bracket. And what we're going to do is all the other variables that we've been declaring and sort of creating before have lived in specific code blocks, like when we press a button. But we actually want to create a class level variable that we're going to call and use across multiple events or multiple button presses or things like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and create a list. And so when you type in list and then you do an open caret and close caret, and then you specify the data type of what's going to be in that list, we're basically creating a new collection here. And so when we specify string as the data type between the characters, it means only string of basically data can be added to this list. So I can't add numbers or any other types of objects. It's limited to basically strings. Now I'm going to call this profiles. Now here I'm just declaring this class level field or variable that I'm going to use. And then down here, when the actual form loads, I'm going to instantiate or basically, here I'm declaring it, but I'm going to actually instantiate an empty list. So I'm going to say profiles equals new list and string. And so when you instantiate a new class or a new list, you basically have the parentheses at the end of it, and you use this new keyword. And this is basically saying that profiles, when the form loads, is now creating a blank empty list, and we can start adding stuff to it. So let's do that. We'll just say on a new line, profiles, and we'll say dot add, and there's actually this add method or function that allows us to add additional strings to that empty list. So let's go ahead and say W12 by 14. And then we'll put a semicolon at the end of that statement. We can say profiles.add, and let's do W24 by 55. And again, remember all strings need to be inside of quotes. And since we're doing a method or a function here, and the function is add, and if you actually hover over with the IntelliSense, it'll show you that when you're adding a string to this list, you put it in parentheses, and then it's expecting you to pass a string for the value that's going to be added in there. All right, so we'll go ahead and close that off with a semicolon. Now, essentially what I want to do is if I go over back to the form designer, I'm going to double click on the show button, which is going to create an event handler for when the user clicks the show button. So what I want to do is I'm actually going to preview a little bit of something that I was going to show in the next tutorial video, which is actually looping through lists or doing like basically iteration through collections. So in this case here, I'm going to do a for each loop. So watch this. I'm going to type the words for each, and then basically there needs to be parentheses here. Okay, and so what we're going to do is we're going to say for each string data type, and we'll just call this string, so for each string in the collection of profiles, so for each string in the list of profiles, basically what I want to do is I want to actually basically show that as a list that I can display on my dialog box. So there's that label results.text, and what we can do is we can plus equals, and we can add essentially that string to that label results string. So we can say plus equals, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say string.format, and I actually showed this syntax in the strings video. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a space bar, then I'm going to put my special basically indexer here for calling out, putting in this string. So again, if you need to go back and look at string format, you can either search that on Google or go back to that previous video. But essentially what I'm doing is this plus equals is sort of a shorthand for saying that, there's an existing value for the label results text, and plus equals is basically just saying I'm appending additional strings to the end of that value. So it's going to read through each one of the strings in the profiles list, and it's just going to keep adding that, and it's going to put a space between each profile that I add to that string. All right, so let's actually take a look and see if this code works. So I'm going to press start here. Looks like everything builds, and I'm just going to press the show button. When I do that, it basically shows W12 by 14 and puts a space, and then W24 by 55. Now the other thing that you'll notice that it did here is it left the word results there because results already existed. So it did results space W12 by 14 space W24 by 55. So this plus equals is essentially a way to just append or add additional strings to the end of the existing string here that we had. Now, this is a very basic explanation of this for each loop, and I'm going to come back to loops in the next video, but I just wanted to be able to see any kind of values that we add to the profiles list and actually show that on the user interface so that way I can test and verify everything's working. Now, let's go ahead and go back to the UI, and we're going to go ahead and double click on the add button, and then we will also double click on the remove button, and that will create two new event handlers for us. So in this code block for the add, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say profiles.add. So there's an add method again, same method we used up here, but instead of a hard-coded fixed string like we did before, let's actually go grab the text box that we have on the UI, and we're going to get the text field or whatever's filled in by the user, and we're going to add that to the collection or to the list. Now on the remove, what I'm going to actually do is I'm just going to say profiles.remove. And you can either say remove a specific string, or you can say remove all instances of a certain string, or you can actually remove at a specific index or location in the list. And I'll come back to that here in a second. So I'm just going to go ahead and say remove. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and say text underscore inputs.text. So it's going to take whatever text I filled in, look at the last index or in the list, and if it sees a match, it's going to remove that out. All right, so we're going to go ahead and just save this here. I'll go ahead and start and debug, and let's see if this works. Again, just to start out with, we'll show that we have the default list here, 12 by 14 and 24 by 55. Let's go ahead and add W16 by 26. Now, I'll press add, then I'm going to press show to verify that it works. Okay, so look at what I've done here. Now, I've got to go back and change something with my code, because basically it's just continuing to add on to the previous label text that we had there, and that's not exactly what we want. So what I really need to do is I actually need to come in here and I need to say label results.text is equal to empty, just to show at first here so it clears it out, and then basically we're just going to add to that string as we go through the loop. So let's go ahead and start this again. We'll press show. Now notice the word results is no longer there, and it's essentially just showing the items in the list. So let's add W16 by 36. We'll say add and then show, and we'll see that that's there. Now, this is a good case, again, based on the user input, that I probably wanted these to be all capitalized, so I should have used the .to upper before I added that string to the list. But we can see an example here, and now watch this. Let's say that I want to remove W12 by 14. So I'm going to go ahead and type in caps lock W12 by 14, and then I'll just go ahead and say remove, then show, and we'll see that that last instance of that value in the list has been removed. Now watch this. I'm going to actually add that twice and then say show. Now we could write code that actually checks to see if that W12 by 14 was already in there and not add it twice. So we could write some code and use some of the stuff that we used in the last lesson with conditional statements to check and see if something is already in that list and not add it twice. Now watch this. If I go ahead and say remove, it's still going to keep one of those instances in there. So that's where remove all, or searching through the entire list and getting rid of all of those particular entries, it might come in handy. So again, you can modify the code. But at a basic level, I want you to mainly see that this is a collection of strings, and then we can iterate through those strings, and we can either grab certain values or we can add and remove things to that list. So why do you need collections? Why do you need lists? Let me give you a good explanation, say in Tekla. So you have a group of selected parts in the model, and you actually need to iterate through a collection or list of all of those parts that you had selected, and then you need to get information or modify a certain property about them. And so that's fundamentally how coding works, is when you have a whole group of objects, you need to store them in a collection or a list or a container, and basically then use loops to iterate through that to either process it or read information from that. So essentially, collections or lists, they work hand in hand with also working with loops and iterators of basically going through each of those objects. Now, one last thing I'll show you here is let's actually just make another button real quick. So I'm gonna move the results over, and I'll just create another button. So I'll just copy paste here, and we'll just say get. I'll just call this get as an example. We're going to get at a specific index, and I've got my caps lock on here. Sorry about that. So we'll just say get. And then again, just as good coding practice, let's rename this button to get. And so if I double click on this, I now have a new code block or a new event handler that I can do stuff with. And since profiles, again, is a class level field or variable, I can actually use this across different code blocks. And in this particular case, I'm going to get the value of a specific spot in the list. So watch this. I'm going to go ahead and say, let's see, label results.text is going to equal, and essentially we're going to say profiles. And what you can do is you can use square brackets, open and close, and you'll notice with the IntelliSense here, it says that I can specify an index position number. So if I had 10 items in the list, I could use 0 through 9 to get a specific value at a specific placeholder or spot in the list. So let's say that I want to get the first item in the list. Well, then I would enter in a 0 index, because in programming, the first item in a list or the first character in a string is always a 0 index. So I'm going to go ahead and put in 0 here. And then I'm just going to go ahead and run this code. And when I say get, basically it shows W12 by 14 is the first value in that list. Now let's change this to basically 1. So I'll go ahead and put in 1 here. We'll run this code, and then we'll say get, and it shows the second item in the list, W24 by 55. Now what happens if I go ahead and I put in something in here, a number that is beyond the actual number of items in that list? So index number 8, I know there's not that many items because there's only 2 things I've added to the list. Well, when I do that, that actually throws an exception. So this is what's really great, is if your code does something that is unacceptable, most of the time Visual Studio is going to catch that either before you actually run the application. But if something is actually happening runtime where you're passing a bad variable or something doesn't work, then essentially the program is going to throw an exception. So basically it's saying that, hey, I can't do this. And in this particular case, it's saying index was out of range because you tried to get a value from a profiles list that doesn't have that many items in it. And so what you have to then do is create exception handlers that will look for these kind of bad inputs and things like that, or prevent that from happening in the first place. And that's good practice with code. And we're going to talk about exception handling using try statements in a later video. All right, so if an exception does happen and you're in the middle of debugging your code, you just press the stop button here at the top, or underneath debug, you just say stop debugging, and that will discontinue and close out the application. So at a high level here, we've covered basic lists where we've specified a list and a data type of the type of objects that are going to be in that list. We added some here at the beginning when we first created and instantiated that list. So again, instantiation, what that means is in C#, it's creating an instance of this profiles list or an instance of a class. So you could have lots of string lists, and they don't have to be all called profiles. You could have a material grades list of strings. So whenever you instantiate basically a new class or a new object, you use this new keyword here, and then basically you're defining a new instance of that object type or that class type. So we added some profiles. We saw here how we could actually get each of the variables, and we did a simple loop to where we read each of the strings in the profile list, and we showed that in the results label on the UI. And then we had an add and remove button, which would actually remove specific values from the list. And then we actually came in here and we could find a specific index in that list as well. Now, let's say that we want to prevent adding something that's already in the list. So I don't want the same profile being added to the list twice. So what I can do is let's just finish up with one example piece of code here where we'll say an if statement, which we took a look at that in the previous video. If the text inputs.text is already in there, right? So watch this. I'm going to say if profiles.contains, and then here you can say, does it contain a string already in that list? So I'm going to say text underscore inputs dot toUpper. So let's put text first. So we're getting the text property of the text inputs. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say dot toUpper. So no matter what the user types, basically I'm going to check for that uppercase. And then if that is basically not true, so if it does not contain that, so remember from the last video, we had to put an exclamation at the beginning for not equal to true. So if it does not contain basically what if the profiles list does not contain what the user entered in the text box on the UI, then we're going to go ahead and add that profile. And so here we're just going to go ahead and take this toUpper, and we'll just copy this down. And again, if I don't want to type that code in, this is a little bit trashy. What I've done here is what I can do is I can actually capture that string, and I can say user profile. There we go. So it already does the uppercase, and then I can just replace this here with that variable name. So user profile. And then I can just use user profile now in both of these spots rather than all of that switching to uppercase on each time. So there we go. First, we're getting the text field. We're capitalizing it. We're checking to see if the profiles list already contains that. If it does not contain that here, which is what we're showing with this exclamation mark, if this is not true and it doesn't contain that user profile, then let's add it to the list. All right, so let's see if that works. Let's run this code. Let's type in W21 by 44. Notice it's lowercase. We're going to go ahead and say add, and then I'll say show. So it adds W21 by 44. Now let me try adding it again, and I'll press show, and it does not add that to the list. All right, well, let's try W16 by 36. Let's say add, show, and it does add that. If I try to add it again multiple times and say show, notice it does not add it because we have that if statement in here that's preventing existing profiles from being re-added to the list. All right, so that shows you some of the basics on doing lists. There are a variety of different collections. In the next video, I'm actually going to showcase dictionaries. And dictionaries or hash tables are another type of basically lookup a collection where you can actually have a key value where you're trying to look up something based on a key that you have and it'll return an object. So I'll explain that in the upcoming next video.